Good morning. Okay, I want to talk about the Indian of Nevuah. We're going to start a series about Nevuah, Ruach HaKodesh, Paschal, Chalemis, Geiralis, all sorts of ways that HaKadosh Baruch Hu communicates with mere mortals, and the varying degrees. Nevuah is on a sliding scale, and the varying degrees that it exists. It just, we say Animam, and one of the Animamins is Shezei Satayr Leitei Muchlefes, right? That the Torah, the prescribed knowledge that we get from the Torah is Leitei Muchlefes. It's suitable, for every dar, for every issue that we face. Now, in particular, in this sugya of Nevuah, it's interesting to find, like some of the same themes that exist literally thousands of years apart, how similar they are. And I'm going to start with a random tshuva from the Binyan Tzion that has nothing to do with it really, and we'll work our way back, and I'll show you why. The Binyan Tzion, who is Darach Laner, right? So he lived in Germany in the mid-1800s, which is relatively recently. In Tshuva Kuf Nun Dalet over there, he has a hair-raising question that was asked him as follows. He says there was a family. He says, I'm going to tell you a shayla. It says, Bam Maisel Lefanai. I'm going to tell you a story. Asher Kol HaShemea Tetzalena Shnei Aznav. It's a wild story, he says. It makes your ears tingle when you hear this story, he says. V'achas HaKvarim, there was a village. There was two Jews who lived there, and the normal mahalach was that these two Jews would go on business. There was a very small Jew village. They would go do business together, wherever they went. And Vayhi Yom, they went on a business trip to wherever the marketplace nearby to their town was, and they left their wives at home. And the women were these sincere, earnest women. He says, Vayhi Yom, ve'ish echad bam in Medinas Poland. A Polish Yid shows up. Ubegadav kruim, his clothing is ripped. He asks from the woman of the house over there if he could have a place to sleep. She was a isha tznuah, she had rachmanis, and she gave him a place to sleep. And she offered him some food and some drink a little bit. He says, but the guest, he wouldn't touch anything. He wouldn't eat, he wouldn't drink. He would sit wrapped in his talis and tefillin all 6 days of the week, from morning to night. Totally orangutan in his learning and saying Tehillim, and he says he didn't sleep on a bed. Whenever she came in to see if the room needed any tidying up, the bed was made as it was from day one. He never slept in a bed. There was like little stones on the floor that he left to put under a pillow. He would dip himself in the cold waters of the river twice a day. This is what he did from Yom Echad Parshas Truma until Shabbos Kodesh Parshas Tetzaveh. So he did this for, whatever, right? It's 10 days, whatever it is. He put in a little bit of a tkufa of putting up this whole facade, charade of who he is. Everyone else went to sleep already, he says. And this person, he was sitting by the table at the end of the Suda, and they got into a deep conversation. And he finally decides to reveal the mask. She asks him, where are you from? Where are you coming from? Where are you heading to? Who are you? Where are you up to? And he says, I'm a messenger from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ushmi Eliyahu HaNavi. My name is Eliyahu HaNavi. I'm here to be goyel, my brothers, the children of Klal Yisrael. But I'm only allowed to tell this to people who are mamish tzenua. But Isha, L'roiv Sechlusa, he says, this woman, because of the great amount of stupidity that she had, Haminale, she believed him. So she went to sleep. Later that night, he fooled her. He fooled her more. He continues the story, and then the ending of the shaila is like, what's the halacha over here? Sunday morning, she writes a letter to her husband, still thinking that she was with Eliyahu HaNavi, who's going to produce. He convinces her that together they could produce Mashiach. She writes to her husband, who obviously was not as big of a nar, and he writes Darach Laner. Now, this is a tshuva it's not that long ago. This is probably 1880, not very long ago. What do you say? Yeah, this is a tshuva from 1880, where Darach Laner is writing this shaila, where someone presented himself, acted for a certain amount of time like a Greis Tzaddik, presented themselves as a Navi, and then proceeded to use their stature as a Navi to defile this woman and do terrible things. Now, to me, what was striking is that the psukim in Yirmiyah, in Prakim Chavtes, other places there in Yirmiyah, there's a great preponderance of Nevi'im Sheker. It's interesting. And in Parak Chavtes, in Pasuk Chaf Aleph, it brings the names of two Nevi'ei Sheker over there. It says, Kaya Mar Hashem Tzavakis, Elikei Yisrael, Al Achav ben Kulya, Vel Tzidkiyahu ben Masya, Hanaviyim Lechem B'Shmi Sheker, you two Nevi'im who are Misnabe B'Shmi L'Sheker, Hinini Noisen Noisen B'Yad Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel, V'Hikam Le'inechem. I'm going to give you over to the hands of Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel, and he's going to destroy you in front of your eyes. It continues on a little bit. Now, what's the story of these two Nevi'im? The Yirmiyah brings down in the Pasuk, there's these two Nevi'ei Sheker, these two people who peddle their falsehoods. Now, Chazal in the Yalkut Shemaini and the Gemara in Sanhedrin and the Tzaddik Gimel tell us as follows. There was these two Nevi'im, and what they would do is basically what this guy in the Aruch LaNer's Tshuva, in the Binyan Tzion's Tshuva did, as a tag team. It says they were part of the group of Klal Yisrael that was Heglet at Bavel a little earlier in advance. And what they would do is they would find a target. It was usually a woman of high society, someone, a minister's wife or whatever, and one of them would approach, knock on the door and say, I'm Tzidkiyahu ben Masya, I'm a Navi. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu was mitzav me to talk to your wife. And the man would say, no problem, she's over there, go talk to her. And he would approach her and he would say, listen, I'm a Navi, and Hashem told me that you should be with Achav, what's the other one's name? Achav ben Kulya. And really, Hashem wants that? Yeah, that's what Hashem wants. Okay, so she'd be with Achav ben Kulya. 2 days later, Achav ben Kulya would show up and say, Gama ni Navi, and Hashem wants you should be with Tzidkiyahu ben Masya. And they would climb the rungs of society this way until Chazal tell us they got to either the wife or the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, who was suspicious with this, this what they came to ask her, and she went to Nebuchadnezzar and she says, "Kach v'kach amruli." This is what they said. So Nebuchadnezzar says, "No, this doesn't make sense." Nebuchadnezzar says, "Amar Elohim shalelu seina zimahu." The God of these Jews hates zima. He hates licentiousness. This is not something he would want. Next time they approach you, tell them that they have to ask for my hand first. They have to talk to me first. They have to talk to Nebuchadnezzar first. They come in. When they came to her, she sends them to Nebuchadnezzar, to her father or to her husband, whoever it is in this case. Amr he tells them, Man Amr who told you to do this? They say, Amr HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hashem told us to do this. We're Nevi'im. It says, Amr I already double checked. I asked Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, who are my house Nevi'im, my in-house Nevi'im, and they said it's not true. That's not what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. So these Nevi'ei Sheker have no reason to back down. They say, they're Nevi'im and we're Nevi'im. Okay, so we're telling you that it is what Hashem wants. Why prioritize the Nevuah that you're hearing from Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah? So he tells them, fear, but I want to be Baidik you the way I was Baidik Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah. I threw them into the Kivshin Eish and they withstood the test of fire. Let me see if you're also a Navi that could withstand the test of fire. So these Nevi'im were no slouches. No problem, fair enough, but they had three, we're only two. Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah was three Nevi'im together, we're only two Nevi'im. Of course we're not going to get the same protection. So Nebuchadnezzar says, no problem, choose anybody that you want from the whole tzibur, you could take with you. And they choose Yeshua Kohen Gadol, who was a former Kohen Gadol in the Beis HaMikdash, who was Hagla to Bavel together with them. And they figured, take Yeshua Kohen Gadol, that's a pretty good bet at surviving. And Chachavi and Nebuchadnezzar takes all three of them together, Yeshua Kohen Gadol and these two Nevi'ei Sheker, he puts them in a kivshan. And Chazal tell us that these two were burnt to the point, there's a word, the Chazal Darshan, they were burnt to the point where they were like klayas, like roasted nuts. Like burnt down all the way to the point of like a little roasted nut. And Yeshua Kohen Gadol was singed. His clothing was singed. So now Nebuchadnezzar, who's a marvel, Nebuchadnezzar pulls them out and he says, okay, as expected, these I'm not surprised about, but you, Yeshua Kohen Gadol, hey, says you have a good reputation. Why are you singed? Well, so Yeshua Kohen Gadol says, I was in there alone. These two were of no use to me, and these two were of no help. I was there alone. These guys were getting burnt like walnuts and like roasted chestnuts. I was here alone. How do you want me to survive? So Nebuchadnezzar says, yeah, but Avram Avinu was alone. When Nimrod threw him into the fire, he was alone. So to which Yeshua Kohen Gadol says, yeah, but Avram Avinu was alone. I was alone with Rishaim. And once the fire was cooking, I'm saying like it's gonna singe me a little also. Now, Nebuchadnezzar accepted this answer. Chazal do not accept this answer. Chazal say, but why taka? Well, if you should, why taka was Yeshua Kohen Gadol singed? And Chazal tell us of a small avera or whatever. His children did something that was inappropriate, and Yeshua Kohen Gadol should have been meich, and he wasn't. So mainly he was singed. Now, to me, it's striking that you could have the same roadmap. Like when we say Zaysa Torah Leitei Mechlefes, that whatever the klalim that the Torah teaches us, or that the Rishonim teach us, or the Chazal teach us, but how to know what is a Navi and what's not a Navi, whereas true, 2,800 years ago or 2,600 years ago or whatever it is, when Yirmiyah was combating Nevi'e Sheker in his time, as they were when the Aruch LaNer was in 1880, and will continue to be for as long as Klal Yisrael's in Galus. Meaning the whole parameters of this discussion never change. Now, Yirmiyah in particular is full of Nevi'e Sheker. There's so many occurrences of Nevi'e Sheker popping up in Yirmiyah, where Yirmiyah has to do disputations with them. Yirmiyah Parak Chavches, there's a Navi who comes and says, all of the Nevuos that Yirmiyah has been saying that Klal Yisrael is going to Galus, don't worry. Ba'od Shnei Yamim, I'm going to be Shaver Melech Bavel, and Klal Yisrael is going to be just fine, he says. Now, Yirmiyah responds the way any good Jew would. Yirmiyah says, Vayirmiyah Navi El-Chananya Navi Le'inei HaKoinim Le'inei Kalam, he says, Amen, Kein Yasa Hashem. Halavai, Yakum Hashem is the Varach, Asher Neveis El-Hashav Kli Beis Hashem V'chol HaGoyla. Halavai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should do what you're telling and bring everything back, and we should have Geula, and Mashiach should come, and Melech Bavel, Nebuchadnezzar should be destroyed. But he says, Ach Shmale Hadavar, it's not going to be so. And Yirmiyah eventually threatens this Navi Sheker that he's going to die, and this Navi Sheker dies, Ba'id Yermayim, in 2 days this Navi Sheker dies. And there's many, many stories of Nevi'im Sheker. So now, the Abarbanel and others point out that why dafka in the days of Yirmiyah was there so many Nevi'im Sheker? Like, why is there so much narrative about Navi Sheker, Navi Emes in Yirmiyah? And the answer to the is that Yirmiyah lives at the end of the Tkuf of Nevuah. Nevuah is HaKadosh Baruch Hu in an open type of Gilui. HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealing himself in a much more open type of manner than would normally, than we see today, B'chlal. Yirmiyah lives like at that gray area, Kilo, at that threshold where Nevuah is being pulled away from Klal Yisrael slowly. Klal Yisrael is being dislodged from Eretz Yisrael, from the Beis HaMikdash. They're going to head into Galus. Nevuah and Gilui Ashchina and HaKadosh Baruch Hu clearly interacting with Klal Yisrael is being pulled away. So this is like the death throes of it being pulled away, is that there's all sorts of people who are trying to chap on and say, I'm a Navi, I'm a Navi, I'm a Navi. Meaning as Nevuah got less clear and is getting pulled away from Klal Yisrael, so all these fake Nevi'im are trying to stand up and take the crown for themselves. Now, ultimately, Klal Yisrael, this Navi Sheker's Nevuah does not come to pass, and Klal Yisrael goes to Galus, and the Nevuah itself seems to cease. Now, I want to talk about that a little bit, Kilo, what the pratim of when there could be a Navi, how a Navi could exist, and when there can't be. And I think that the year that we have to focus in on is the year 1240. Now, I'll tell you why. It's a fascinating thing. I'm sure everyone could name 10, 15, maybe 20 names of Balei Tosfos, right? But let's say the basic, I'm sure, is 5. Everyone could do 5, and we can work our way up from there, right? The names of Balei Tosfos should be people know. There's a whole cadre, though, of Balei Tosfos that are like unknown somewhat, that all had the subtitle Hanavi. There's a Rabbeinu Ezra Hanavi. He's the most, called the prominent of this bunch. Rabbeinu Ezra Hanavi is quoted in Tosfos and Shavuos, I think, on Daf Mem Beis. He's a Talmud of the Ri, who's one of the Ri is the most quoted Baal Tosfos in all of Tosfos. Over 3,000 times the Ri is quoted. Ezra Hanavi is quoted once, but a Talmud of the Ri, and he had such a Richas Yamim that he was one of the Rebbeim of the Merami Rotenberg, who was like from the last school of the Balei Tosfos. So now, it's strange to note that around that Kufa, there was all these Nevi'im, and I want to talk about that Kufa a little bit, and how all these Rishonim got the subtitle Navi. But let's just set the table first with the Kilo, let's call it the basic parameters and prerequisites of Nevuah, of being a Navi. Now, the Gemara in Megillah, and Daf Yudal Amud Aleph, tells us, Mem Ches Nevi'im Amdulam Li Yisrael. 48 Nevi'im, Klal Yisrael had 48 Nevi'im that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent to give us Nevuah. And the Gemara goes off, and then the Gemara says famously that there were 7 Nevi'os, 7 female Nevi'im who Klal Yisrael had. So that seems to be the number. Now the Gemara asks on itself, and the Gemara says, was there not many more? V'su leka, was there not many more Nevi'im? And the Gemara says, no. Mia tuvahave, there was taka many more Nevi'im. Kedetanya harba Nevi'im amdulam li Yisrael keflayim ki yotzei Mitzrayim. There was like 2 times the yotzei Mitzrayim. Now if yotzei Mitzrayim, depending on which calculation you want to go with, is millions, al kapanim. And then, it could go up very high if you do the Mechilta's math or whatever. It could be very high. But keflayim ki yotzei Mitzrayim. But says the Gemara, something that was like necessity, essential for Klal Yisrael to maintain forever, was written down, was transmitted, and other nevuos were much more temporary in nature. They were a small gila and they were gone. Now Rashi over here brings down from Midrashim who the 48 Nevi'im are. It's probably like a song that girls memorize in high school or something. We'll never know it, but there's the list of 48 Nevi'im who are the basic Nevi'im. Now, seemingly, what the Gemara is telling us over here is that in the Tkuf of Nevuah, when Nevuah was prevalent, Nevuah was taka prevalent, meaning anybody who was a tzaddik and a yasher and was on a high level could potentially have a nevuah or some nevuah or a scale of nevuah, some sort of grade of nevuah. Now, so when did that end? So the Gemara says, the Gemara in Yuma, and it's a Gemara in Moed Katan, and it's a Gemara, I think in 3 places, Sanhedrin also. The Gemara says, Mishemesu Neviim ha'achronim, when the last Neviim died, Chagai Zechariah Malachai, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh MiYisrael. Ruach HaKodesh was Nistalka MiYisrael. Now, it's interesting to note that word Ruach HaKodesh is used over here, because in coming weeks we'll talk about Ruach HaKodesh as something for itself. But over here the Gemara uses them interchangeably. When the Nevi'im ha'achronim died, Chagai Zechariah Malachai, so then Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh MiYisrael, and there was no more Nevi'im. But v'adayinay mishtamshim bebaskel. They would still use baskel. There was still this methodology of using a baskel. Now, what is a baskel? So Taisvis in Yuma, in Sanhedrin and Nafid Aleph and Amud Aleph, Taisvis describes it. Taisvis says that baskel means like, I'll read it for you. Taisvis says, Yeshayim rim shleih yeshayim in koila yotzim min hashemayim. They didn't hear a clear voice coming out of Hashemayim. Ela mitoich oisei kol yotze koil acher. Kamei pa'amim shad makeh b'koyach v'shemei koil acher, like an echo. Like an echo of a koil. There would be a koil and an echo of a koil. So it's vague and hard to hear and hard to place. When you hear an echo, you're not sure which direction it's coming from, and you're not sure, it's much more vague and hard to place. It needs a lot more interpretation, and which is why Chazal many, many times, and I can't even list all the Gemara, say, Ein mashgichim baskel. We don't pay attention to baskel. And anything regarding to a din, anything regarding to halacha, Ein mashgichim baskel. A baskel is too vague, too unclear to actually name it on like that, like a nevuah. So now this is what Chazal seem to say, very clearly, that Nevuah had a best if used by date. Meaning it started by Moshe Rabbeinu, maybe by the Avis, but it started by Moshe Rabbeinu was the Ava Nevi'im, and then from then on, it went through the Beis HaMikdash Harishon, and by the end of the Beis HaMikdash Harishon, and these Nevi'im Achronim is when the Nevuah ends. Ad Kedei Kach that in Eicha, the pasuk says, I forgot the exact whole pasuk. It says, here I had Tavu Ba'aretz Shareh. Right, the pasuk in Eicha, when it's bemoaning Klal Yisrael's sad state, and Klal Yisrael lost its special stature, it says it's Tamid Chachamim don't have Torah, v'gam Nevi'el lematzu chazayin. It's Nevi'im can't see anything anymore. So chazayin was taken away from Klal Yisrael. Now this is seemingly kilu chadma. What I'm saying? Like the Gemara doesn't bring a chaylik, the Gemara doesn't bring 2 days, the Gemara doesn't bring an alternate understanding. The Gemara says Mishemesu Nevi'im Achronim Chagei Zechariah Malachai. It's in few places. The Gemara says Batla Nevi'im Nevuah Yisrael. Nevuah was ended. Now there's another Chazal that's important to note over here, and that is that Chazal in Moed Katan and the Gemara in Daf Chafei seem to say that Nevuah could only be shared on someone who's in Eretz Yisrael. There was Nevi'im who out. So the Gemara has Terutzim, Chazal have Terutzim in different midrashim for each one of them. If a Navi started having his Nevuah in Eretz Yisrael, could be a continue in Chutz La'aretz, could be before Eretz Yisrael was actually given to Klal Yisrael, before the Beis HaMikdash Nevuah could be in Chutz La'aretz. We know from Yaina Lamashal, right? Yaina, he says, I'll get up and I'll run away. Chazal explained this, I'll get up and I'll run away because if I'm not in Eretz Yisrael, my Nevuah can't be sharing me. I'm cutting the Wi-Fi. Hashem can't talk to me anymore. That was what Yaina was saying. So Chazal in many places, many midrash, and many Chazal seem to say clearly that Nevuah could only be someone who's in Eretz Yisrael. Mashma, someone who's only in Eretz Yisrael, mamish. There's some exceptions. So for that, Chazal give answers. There's exceptions. In the time of Nevuah, there was a way for someone who had started his Nevuah in Eretz Yisrael to continue in his Nevuah in Chutz La'aretz. But this is pretty clear in Chazal that a Nevuah, a Navi is not something you're going to find roaming the streets now. B, it's only going to be someone who's in Eretz Yisrael. These are 2 prerequisites that Chazal establish. Now, there's many, many more prerequisites to this, and this is the interesting part. The Rambam, who wrote a halacha sefer, the Rambam, for the most part, there is some divrei musar in the Rambam, and there's actually a guy from Eretz Yisrael now, close Talmud of Chaim Kanievsky, Uri Tiger, who put out a sefer on all the musar bits of the Rambam, like Musrei Rambam, but it's a thin sefer. You know what I'm saying? And he wrote pages and pages in each one of them, and it's still a thin sefer. The Rambam wrote a halacha sefer be'eker, and the Rambam still takes the time to dedicate many chapters in the end of Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah to Hilchos Nevuah. So the Rambam seemingly seems to hold that the halachas of Nevuah are still relevant. They still apply. Now, obviously, that shouldn't be a big chiddush to us, because we understand that when Mashiach's going to come, and when Eliyahu Navi is going to come, there's going to be a return to some of the gilui that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had with us, back in the day. And Chadash Yemenu Kekedem, we're going to have some sort of giluyim like they were giluyim, and there's going to be pratim of Nevuah. And therefore, the Rambam fills up chapter and chapters over here. I'm not going to read through all of it, of all the pratim of a Navi has to bring, what type of person a Navi has to be, what type of Oisis Umaysim a Navi has to bring, etc., making it, relatively difficult to qualify by the Rambam's, prerequisites to be a Navi. Now, even more so than the Rambam just putting this in Yad HaChazaka, is fascinating what the Rambam in Igeres Teiman does. There's a famous letter from the Rambam, it's called Igeres Teiman, which we don't know the person who he's talking about, but there was a person who came to the Jews of Yemen who first introduced himself as a Navi and then introduced himself as Mashiach. It was a build-up. First he introduced himself as a Navi, and then eventually, once he was on the Navi, he was on the selection committee for Mashiach, and he said, let me select Mashiach. Oh, it's me. And that was the selection process that this Navi did, and he started being a Navi, and then he ended up being Mashiach. Now the Rambam, eventually, it's a fascinating person, this person. He was so charismatic and so popular that he was able to convince a lot of Muslims that he was Mashiach too. He was able to convince a lot of a peasant's a peasant. He was able to, whatever sprach he was talking, he was able to, it worked for the Jewish simple folk and the Muslim simple folk of the time. And he was able to convince them that he was Mashiach, ad kedei kach, that he started finding Ramazim in the Torah for Muhammad and for Allah and for whatever they needed. And the Rambam in Igeres Teiman is we could call it 4 parts. In the beginning, he disputes all the nevuahs that this guy had, suggesting that Muhammad was a Navi, and disputes all the ways this guy is misreading the psukim or whatever. Then, and continues on, and he goes into the sugya of nevuah. And the Rambam says how hard it is to be a Navi, all the pratim that he works at in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, and why this person's not a Navi and doesn't have the criteria to be a Navi, and etc. And then he continues on, and he says, in Igeres Teiman, that nevuah is going to come back. Now the Rambam brings a Mesorah from the Gaonim as to when nevuah is going to come back. Based on Bilam's nevuah, a pasuk by Bilam's nevuah, he brings a Mesorah from the Gaonim that nevuah is going to come back. And if you do the math, the year that the Rambam suggests nevuah is going to come back is the year 1240. That's what the Rambam suggests, is the year 1240. Now, not with any certainty. What do you say? Rambam was nifter already by then. Rambam was nifter in the end of the 1100s. It was something out of his realm. And there's a lot of ink has been spilled to explain how the Rambam, who spends a lot of time saying one should not prognosticate and predict when Mashiach's coming and when Nevuah is coming and all these things, why the Rambam himself seems to violate his own tenets, and do that. And Pashas, the Rambam wanted to give chizik to this downtrodden group of people who he was pulling away Mashiach from them, meaning they believed they already had Mashiach, and he was biyadayim pulling away Mashiach and pulling away the Navi. He wanted to give them something that was right beyond the horizon. Something too far away that you're not going to do anything practical related to it, but close enough that you don't give up hope. Like, if something's in 1240, maybe it could come early, but not that you're going to do anything practical about it. So the Rambam was giving them some sort of further expiration date to keep them fresh and in the game. But Yirshia, the Rambam brings down this Mesorah from the Gaonim. Now, because of this Mesorah from the Gaonim, either directly from the Rambam or from others who knew the same Mesorah, right around the year 1240, you see like a mamish, a sprinkling of Nevi'im. Now, not Nevi'im who said Nevuahs, but people who are referred to as Hanavi. These Rishonim all live right around that Kufa. Rav Ezra Hanavi and the other Nevi'im, the other 6 Nevi'im who are named, I don't remember the names offhand a second, all live right around that Kufa, meaning in the way, what it means is the way you would pay a compliment to someone during a time when you're expecting Nevuah to reascend and to come back onto the table, the way you pay a compliment and say, this is a Kaddish V'Torah, this is a person who is Hanavi. Not he is a Navi, not he came with a Nevuah, because none of these people came with Nevuahs. Hanavi, he's worthy of a Nevuah. This is how you would give someone this credentialing. Now, rather there is some who say that Rav Ezra Hanavi gave over some kind of Nevuah based on Chagei Zechariah Malachai, some sort of Nevuah. I don't know enough about it to say one way or the other, but I just want to mention it, not to be remiss. But in the Ashkenazi world, none of these people were claiming to actually be Nevi'im. These were Hanavi, like a compliment. Now, incidentally, on the other side of the world, there was someone who used this exact time to become an actual Navi. And that is Reb Avram Abulaf, Reb Avram or Reb Chaim? Either Reb Avram or Reb Chaim, Reb Avram Abulafia. Now, this is a fascinating thing. He was born in the year 1240 to a father. He was born in Spain. His father was a marginal Talmud Chacham who spent time teaching him Gefes. At 18 years old, he was unmarried still. His father dies. And he has some sort of break. Like he starts roaming the streets and traveling and trying really hard to find himself, to place himself. He makes the arduous trek all the way to Eretz Yisrael, which at that time in 1240 is the middle of the Crusades. It's extremely difficult to travel to Eretz Yisrael. He makes the trip. He plans an excursion to look for the Saras HaShvatim. Ultimately, it gets canceled because he goes to the port of Akko and all he sees over there is ships bringing in weapons and soldiers and whatever. It was not a time for travel, b'chlal, so it gets canceled. But he is this roaming soul who really, really desperately is looking for something, searching for something. Eventually he goes to Italy, he gets married, then he goes to Greece. He's all over the world. He travels all over the world. At some point, he announces that he's a Navi. He says that he's a Navi, and to do something different than all the other Nevi'im who announce themselves, he writes a sefer of Nevuah, full of giluyim and things that he wants to share with people and teach people, and etc. Now, he ultimately, he puts together a large following, and at some point it seems either he or those around him announce that he's Mashiach, and based on a cryptic line that the Ramban had said years earlier, that the Ramban had said during one of his disputes, the Ramban had said, when Mashiach will go, think how twisted this is. The Ramban was saying Mashiach is not here yet. The Ramban said, when Mashiach will come and announce himself to the Pope in the Vatican, and he'll get the Pope to shalzut to him, we'll know Mashiach has been here. And says so. So Rabbi Avraham Abulafi decided he's going to go to the Vatican to cow the Pope. And he announces that he's traveling to the Vatican with his whole entourage to go talk to the Pope. The Pope desperately did not want to meet him. And the Pope went to his vacation house, his vacation villa, wherever that was, and left a note behind that if Abulafi shows up, cut his head off. That was his instructions. Now the Pope, it was an older person, went to his vacation house, and before Avraham Abulafi made it to Rome, to the Vatican, he dies. Now this was seen as like a major sign that the Pope had messed with someone he couldn't mess with, and they put Rabbi Avraham Abulafi in prison for 28 days, but they did not kill him. And when he left prison, he was turbocharged. He left with the fact that he had killed the Pope for raising his hand against him, and he was turbocharged. He went on to go weiter with this. Now,
he was accepted by the
so 1 second. So thanks to him, we have one of the most yisaidistic chuvas about Navi, not Navi, Bizman Hazeh, from the Rashba. Because the Rashba stamped out the Abulafia movement fully. The Rashba ruined his career, and ultimately he dies in ignominy, meaning he wanders around, he continues wandering, but without Hasidim, without anything. The Rashba writes a tshuva, it's tshuva Tavkov Memches and Chelik Aleph, where the Rashba writes, he says, this crazy person came in front of me with lots of books, and only, he says, with the Chamlas Hashem was I able to push him out of my house, he says. Otherwise he would have talked. This is what the Rashba was writing. This person came, he barged in with all his books and his nevuah, says, and I looked at them a little bit, and he says, and most of them are, he says, he takes psukim and divrei chachamim begamatrius, u'ma'arvim behem ma'at dvarim amitiyim, some true things, l'kutim misifrei chachma, that he knows from Kabbalah Svarim that precede him. He says, this guy you're talking about, he's an amaret yidua v'shalei hergul by shum adam v'lei amad al shum adam v'lei shum seifim divrei chachma. Rashba says he's mamish, he's an amaret, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's creative, he takes some gematrius and some things that are true, and he puts them together, and he jumbles them, and he sells them to people, and this is his nevuah, he says, navi. This that you want to believe that he's a navi, he says, this is something I can't believe. There's a bunch of reasons, says the Rashba, why this can't be, that he's a navi who was revealed to all the stuff to the Malachim, he says. He says, first of all, you have to be a Chacham, Asher v'Gibor. Those are non-negotiable. Chacham, Asher, Gibor, those are all non-negotiable. Those are all not subjective, those are objective standards. And he's none of those things. Then the Rashba continues and he says, it needs to be, he brings, Chag Zechariah Malachi and Nevuah is Pascha, and he brings that Chazal many times said, Ru'uya per so-and-so, that Tishrul of Shechina, El She'ena Dar Shar Roi Lekach. The Gemara, I should have read it when I was reading the Gemara Sanhedrin. The Gemara says, the Nevuah should have been sharing this person, but the Dar wasn't Roi Lekach. He says, you think that in the Dar, thousands of years before us, the Darius weren't ready. He says, Af Tamidei Hillel Hazakin, Shei Kedoshei Elyon, Gedolim B'Chachma B'Chasidus, Amru Ru'uyim Shtishel Av Shechina K'Moshe, El She'enu Dar Roi Lekach. After Darius Shel Hillel V'Tamidav Chasidim Loihei Roi V'Dareinu Zeh Roi. He says, you think that the Darius of Hillel and Shammai, were not Roi, but our Darius Roi? He says, it's not possible. Then he continues on, he says, there it's Yisrael piece. He says, and he goes through all the pieces, and the Rashba is the ultimate skeptic over here. The Rashba basically assembles all the Chazals that we mentioned, and says, it's not that it's that's the word, I think. It's not that it's impossible. Of course it's possible for there to be a Navi. It's just extremely unlikely. And therefore, if he doesn't, there's so many hoops that he has to jump through that he can't jump through that it's just impossible. And this is the legacy of the Abulafia story, is that we have this truth from the Rashba where he kind of puts like the capstone on all these chazals. He takes all these chazals that we're doing and mushes them into one coherent, theology that it's unlikely. And therefore, the way, Klal Yisrael Federer always, approached people who claimed to Nevi'im was with the Rashba's skepticism. Now, just as a postscript, interesting to note that Avraham Abulafi was a prolific Mechaber Svarim who wrote close to 50 Svarim, and Achrei Mois Kedoshim Emor, his Svarim survived him with good reputation and in good standing. The Mekubalim later on, hundreds of years later, the Ramak and others quoted from him, from his Svarim, Ad Kedei Kach that the Chida in Shem HaGedolim writes that he's not ignoring the fact that Chida writes the Rav Amar Balafia, Chacham Gadol, the Rashba, Achen the Rashba took him to task and said that he was no-go, but later Chachamim accepted his Svarim, and therefore you could use his Svarim. This is what he says. And the Chassam Sofer had a Talmud, Rav Shlomo Fried, in one of his Svarim writes, he collects a few of these examples where you see that a person and the Sefer are dinam l'chod, meaning the person could have had his problems, he was gepaskin, now he's paskin, in his time, in his place, but the Svarim seem to somehow have a way of surviving and then living on. So Rav Amar Balafia is an interesting postscript that his Svarim survive, but he himself, what happens is eventually the person becomes unknown. Nobody knows about Rav Amar Balafia anymore. His reputation is gone. Nobody knows anything about him, and it's just the Svarim. And the Svarim were accepted into the world of Svarim. Now, this is a little overview into the idea of Nevuah, always in Bizman Hazeh, and I'm just trying to highlight the fact that the conflict between Nevuah and Navi Sheker was something that always existed, and it used to be more Nevi'im, less Nevi'im Sheker, and as the time goes on and we more distant from having proper Nevuah, the ratio, flipped in Gansen, and now it's 99% or 99.9% Nevi'im Sheker and very minimal opportunity for actual Nevi'im. Now, Mitzvah in the next few weeks we'll discover some more acceptable formats of someone presenting themselves with knowledge, like Ruach HaKodesh, Paschal, etc., to be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.